A sesión, despois deste breve receso, retomeu a moderación, porque o profesor Maiz vai ter un compromiso despois. É un placer para mí presentarlles a seguir o profesor Stefan Berger, na actualidade catedrático de Historia Contemporánea da Universidade de Bochum, onde dirixe o Instituto de Estudos Movimentos Sociais. Ben, o profesor Stefan Berger, os coñecedores da literatura sobre identidades nacionais, nacionalismos e historiografía non precisa presentación. Despois de estudar en Oxford, pasar varios anos en diversas universidades británicas, que la Morgan en Manchester, volveu a Alemanha. Non lles vou resumir a súa listaxe de publicacións, que é inmensa. Simplemente dicir que entre os múltiplos intereses do profesor Berger están a historia comparada. Nun principio era a historia comparada entre o movimento obreiro e socialdemocracia alemana e británica, despois ampliou a súa perspectiva e, sobre todo, nos últimos anos, concentrado no estudo das historiografías nacionais e nacionalistas. Ten dirixido un grande proxecto europeu da Fundación Europea da Ciencia, no marco do cal se celebraron varios congresos, deles tamén un workshop aquí en Santiago hai 9 anos. Foron publicados diversos volumes, baixo a dirección de outros colegas, e últimamente, quizás a súa obra máis notoria, o ano pasado, en Palgrave Macmillan, é precisamente unha vasta obra de análise comparada da produción de historias nacionais na Europa do século XIX e XX, non entende o Cáucaso até Galicia. Por lo tanto, unha grande honra termos hoxe o profesor Stefan Berger, que nos vai falar dun aspecto máis concreto, como é o impacto da Primeira Guerra Mundial na reformulación das historias nacionais. Professor Berger, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, José, for what I'm sure would have been a very kind introduction. Many thanks also to the Council of Galician Culture for inviting me here, and for everyone who's been involved with this marvelous event here in Santiago. I think it's my third time here in Santiago, and it's always nice to be back. I would like to talk today mainly about national history writing, so about historiography and the impact of the First World War on historiographical narratives in Europe. And basically, I will start off with saying a little bit about the history wars related to the war guilt question after the First World War, because I think here is the first big impact. Secondly, I'll talk about the emerging of new states in interwar Europe and the strong historiographical nationalism that this often brought forward. And thirdly, I'll talk about ideological commitments and challenges to European historiography, in particular the well-established liberal national historiographies of the 19th century were challenged in the interwar period, both by more right-wing and by more left-wing alternatives to those liberal national historiographies. And then finally, briefly, I will talk a little bit about changing borders and borderlands as a consequence of the First World War, and again, how this impacted on historiographies. The First World War generally was a major boost to contemporary history, because after the First World War, governments in all of those countries that had participated in the war looked towards justifying their position in the First World War, and in particular, those nations that had lost the war looked towards challenging the peace treaties at Versailles and at Trianon, whilst those who had won the war obviously tried to do the reverse. As a result, all of the states involved in the war published major document collections, and all of these document collections had a direct political purpose. All states practiced strong censorship in relation to documents that were seen as particularly relevant to the question of war guilt, who started the war in 1914. So access to archives was extremely restricted. Only those historians that were trusted by the respective governments were given access. It was very important in the process that you did not only have the right, in inverted commas, historical scholarship, but that this historical scholarship was also disseminated both via the national and the international media, so that the marketization of scholarship here became more important than is usually the case for historical scholarship. If we look at the case of Germany first, the major document collection, die Große Politik der Europäischen Kabinette, was under the general editorship of Friedrich Timmer. Timmer had argued very early on, just after he had accepted the job, and I quote, "As a politician, he could not accept the view that the publication of the German documents existed for the study of contemporary history as an end in itself," end of quote. Well, that's a pretty direct statement that he was agreeing to the political functionalization of historical research. A memorandum of the Foreign Office in 1921 on this document collection read, and I quote, "The great document publication is not being prepared so that its volumes might only gather dust in archives or be studied by isolated historians with effects which will be apparent only after years," end of quote. Again, direct sort of political functionalization is pretty obvious. Between 1922 and 1927, 40 volumes appeared. In many cases, we have evidence of self-censorship of those historians involved in editing the sources. Plus also, none of the editors were allowed access to the documents from the War Office, Navy Office, and the General Staff. Presumably because the politicians knew that they would find some rather unpalatable things in those archives. So we have a very concrete, deliberate policy to use historical research to revise the Versailles Treaty in Germany relatively soon after the end of the war. Those who published documents not palatable to that effect were also censored. Karl Kautsky was one of those who edited already in 1919 documents which showed the sort of demonstrated that some of the German elites, so that was his intent really, that some of the old German elites were responsible for the outbreak of war in 1919. There was again a massive campaign against Kautsky from within both from within the Foreign Office, and a similar case is Kurt Eisner's publication of documents in Munich newspapers in 1919. So the intervention here of the German state was very clear, sort of direct silencing of people publishing documents that were sort of demonstrating that the German elites in 1914 did have a hand in the outbreak of war, and instead hiring a whole host of historians who were willing to peddle the story that was politically the right story for the German Foreign Office. A war guild section was established at the Foreign Ministry that included a working committee of German associations. It included a center for the study of the causes of the war. There was a parliamentary committee of inquiry. The war guild section edited a monthly journal entitled Die Kriegsschuldfrage. So you can also see that an enormous amount of resources, financial resources, were put into this in order to help the politics of the revision of the Versailles Treaty. If we look at Britain, we have the statement of Austen Chamberlain to the historian G.P. Gooch in 1926, where he says, quote, my first duty is to preserve peace now and in the future. I cannot sacrifice that even to historical accuracy. It's amazing the similarity of the language between Timmer and Chamberlain here. You know, historical accuracy has to be sacrificed in the service of a higher good, and the higher good is that the government is proven right in terms of who started the war. The official conditions of access to Foreign Office records in Britain were also pretty strict. All notes, extracts, and transcriptions of correspondence shall be inspected and approved by Foreign Office officials. So again, we find similar policy like in Germany, only those documents should be released that would prove that Britain was right in entering the war and that Germany was officially to blame for the outbreak of war. So a very tight control by the Foreign Office in Britain, as was the case in Germany. The British collection was a direct response to the Große Politik. Approval was given in 1924, so 5 years after the German Foreign Office had approved the Große Politik. And until 1927, 3 volumes had appeared. So you can see that the British were far less fleißig than the Germans. 3 volumes in comparison to 40 volumes. So the sort of sheer mass. But again, I guess German scholarship has a tradition of killing people with the sheer mass of the research. Again, like in Germany, certain files were out of bounds. The India Office, the Committee for Imperial Defense Files, they could not be consulted by the historians. There had been earlier efforts to, if you like, use history in the service of the British state, in particular the Political Intelligence Department that was created in the Foreign Office already in April 1918, included a number of well-known historians, Toynbee, Namier, Zimmern, were all amongst the members of staff, but the PID had been dissolved in 1919 again, so Britain was really sort of lagging behind the German attempts to start a kind of history war. If we look at France, the French ambassador to Berlin wrote to his foreign minister, Briand, again in 1926, quote, "There can be no doubt that under the influence of the enormous quantity of documents," note the word enormous, that the Wilhelmstrasse has thrown onto the historical market, world opinion has already begun to change to our disadvantage. The rapid publication of the documents in our archives relating to the events of 1914, thus demonstrating particularly to Anglo-Saxon opinion that we have nothing to fear from the judgments of posterity, would be desirable. So again, direct sort of attempt to functionalize history in the pursuit of the political aim of justifying the position in the war. If we look at Russia, the kind of key historian, the chief historian, if you like, Pokrovsky, was the chairman of the commission editing the Russian documents, he argued, and I quote, "We know that the war was not the work of the evil intentions of individual persons and individual groups, but resulted of iron necessity from the economic system of the last decades, the system of monopolistic capitalism. The grasping appetites of all imperialistic governments made for war. For the struggle against imperialism, we must know surely and quite exactly how it acts, of what sort are its procedures and methods. And if the grasping activity of imperialists is irrefutably established by the series of incontestable documents, we shall naturally have a bill of indictment, but a bill of indictment not against a single person or even against a single country, but against a class, and that class is the one which in 1914 held power in its hands in all great countries, and in most of them still holds it." End of quote. I love the rhetoric of this kind of early Bolshevist. It really has some stirring stuff. But the intention is quite clear, also to use historical scholarship in order to prove the point of the Bolshevik government that the ultimate responsibility for the outbreak of war rested with capitalism. Capitalism had been overcome in Bolshevik Russia, so they were clearly not to blame. It's a little bit like that Bob Dylan song about the boxer, where the refrain always is, "I'm not to blame." Sort of, we have a similar kind of policy here vis-à-vis the First World War. It's also interesting to note that this history war had a strong transnational dimension, in the sense that there were frequent consultations, in particular between British and American historians, about which documents should be published. And the coordination between British and the American governments and the historians working for the governments vis-à-vis the document collections. And a similar cooperation was going on between Germany and the Soviet Union. Otto Hötsch, the Russian historian in Berlin, was working very closely with the German Foreign Ministry, establishing links with Soviet Russia in order to find in the archives in Russia documents that would sort of prove the German point. So we see that there were lots of contacts there. Ultimately, those who lost the war won the history war. The German campaign was on the whole quite influential. There were a number of historians in Britain, in the US, in France, but also politicians in the US who were referring to the German document collection, arguing that the peace treaty had been unjust and that it had to be revised and that Germany was treated very badly as a result. So the kind of revisionism that the German Foreign Office wanted to peddle with the collection was successful in the interwar period, and I think contributed to a climate that would ultimately result in the kind of appeasement policies of the 1930s. Yeah, same point. Now, if I move to my second point, the historiographic nationalism in the emerging new states, the examples are really endless, and I will just give a few here. If we look at Finland, soon after Finland gained independence in 1917, we have the refoundation of the University of Turku in 1920, which was explicitly founded in order to rival the still Swedish-speaking at the time and allegedly unpatriotic University of Helsinki. In particular, the nationalist Finnish intelligentsia organized a nationwide fundraising campaign to endow the university with, in particular, a strong history department. It became one of the bulwarks of Finnish nationalist history in the interwar period, the kind of history that was represented by Jalmari Jaakkola in particular. Finland is an interesting case where, in a way, out of civil society emerges this kind of historiographical nationalism. It's not the state in this case which is the sponsor. It's largely sort of civic society. If we look at Latvia, there I think Latvian national historians very much concentrated on establishing a Latvian national master narrative, and that meant above all refuting the claims of Baltic German historiography and focusing on agrarian history. They aimed to show that the claims of Baltic Germans to the land were spurious and that the redistribution of land to Latvian smallholders was historically justified. When in 1936 the Latvia History Institute was founded at Riga, it had the explicit task, which was actually written into its foundational document, of studying, quote, the past in the light of nationalism and truth, end of quote. It's remarkably honest, some of these documents of the interwar period. If we look at the Irish Free State established in 1922, we also see the emergence of a strongly nationalist professional historiography, which was, though intriguingly, modeled on its arch-enemy, on Britain. The Irish Manuscripts Commission was founded as a government-funded agency, took its cue very much from the British Historical Manuscripts Commission. The key historians who were to professionalize Irish historiography from the 1930s onwards were all trained in Britain, in particular at University College London, where they benefited from the Institute of Historical Research, which had been established there in 1921. In particular, Robert Dudley Edwards and Theodore William Moody, who were arguably the most notable Irish historians to emerge from that training. They founded the Irish Historical Society in 1936 and the Ulster Society for Irish Historical Studies. These societies began publishing the journal Irish Historical Studies, again edited by Edwards and Moody. So you see that in terms of historiographical development, Britain provided the model for Ireland. Most of these historians combined their adherence to scientificity with strong doses of nationalism, and as they trained the next generation of historians in Ireland, that became a strong tradition in Irish historiography. In the new composite state of Czechoslovakia, professionalization and institutionalization of history writing was also given a major boost by the formation of the new state. Reference to ancient Slavs, Great Moravians, Hussites, the Slavonic Congress, the 1848 Revolution, the Czechoslovak Legion in the First World War, they all served the purpose of underpinning nation building after 1918. The problem here, though, I think, was that right from the start, the Czechoslovak national narrative was deeply contested, with in particular Slovak historians keeping their distance, so that you had the kind of fissure here going through the historiography also in the interwar period. If we look at interwar Turkey, the vast majority of the younger Turkish historians had joined the Turkish foyers just before the First World War, and over the course of the next 2 decades, they were at the forefront of formulating a Turkish historical narrative, very much in service of Kemal Atatürk's political regime. The Turkish History Society, founded in 1931, provided the framework for a number of quasi-official historical projects. Some of its leading members later became politicians, again underlining the proximity of historical studies and politics in the Republic of Turkey. It's interesting that overall, I think, if we look at these cases of historiographical nationalism in newly founded states in the interwar period, the financial prowess of the state was clearly important for many of these projects, but it's also interesting that a potential weakness of the state could be counterbalanced by strong civil society initiatives. So it didn't necessarily need a strong state to provide the resources for this historiographical nationalism. Now, we move to my third section, ideological commitments and challenges. We have here in the interwar period perhaps the strongest defense of a traditional liberal national master narrative in Britain. And I think a good example of that is the opening of the British Parliament in 1935, when the King, George V, delivered a speech that had been written for him by the historian George Trevelyan. And in here he says, and I quote, "It is to me a source of pride and thankfulness that the perfect harmony of our parliamentary system with our constitutional monarchy has survived the shocks that have in recent years destroyed other empires and other liberties. The complex forms and balanced spirit of our constitution were not the discovery of a single era, still less of a single party or of a single person. They are the slow accretion of centuries, the outcome of patience, tradition, and experience, constantly finding outlets for the impulse towards liberty, justice, and social improvement inherent in our people down the ages." And it's a very clear, and one of the, if you want to put Whiggism in a nutshell, you have it, I think, in this opening speech to Parliament in 1935. So it's a very proud assertion of a Whig view of historiography, stressing constitutional liberties and democratic traditions. And it's interesting that even those who in the interwar period would become staunch critics of Whiggism ultimately adhere to the same values. If we look at Herbert Butterfield, who became famous for demolishing the theoretical underpinnings of Whiggism, in practice, he could not free his writing from the continued belief in a national history that followed a civilizational path towards greater liberty. Louis Namier, also an iconoclast when it came to Whiggism, was nevertheless a lifelong admirer of British political institutions for which he had the highest regards. Linda Colley, the biographer of Namier, wrote, quote, "For him, Namier, Britain was the epitome of constitutional wisdom and organic development, whereas Germany, Britain's counterpoise, was characterized by violence, chaos, and ineptitude," end of quote. So, even the critics of Whiggism couldn't really escape the pull of Whiggism in interwar Britain. Britain was not the only one upholding liberal national historiographical master narratives. In France, obviously, the interwar period saw the kind of emerging Annales school. And here we find a strong cosmopolitan, non-ethnic orientation towards history writing, influenced in particular by Henri Pirenne, whom the founders of the Annales, Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, initially wanted to win as editor of the journal Annales. He declined, but they were very much inspired by his attempt to de-ethnicize Belgian history in the interwar period. We also have countries such as Switzerland. You have the kind of strong liberal narrative that is connected to medieval liberties, also to geography, to the Alps, but it's all about the defense of liberty and federalism in Swiss national history. And in some countries, in particular in Scandinavia, you also have the development of this traditional liberal 19th century narrative into a more social democratic narrative. In Norway, two of the most famous historians, Halvdan Koht and Edvard Bull, actually took office as social democratic foreign ministers in the interwar period, closely allying liberal democracy and historiography in the 19th century with the social democratic project of the 20th century. Czechoslovakia, I think, provided one of the few cases of a successful liberal national historiography in the interwar period in East Central Europe. The dominating influence of Masaryk, I think, was important here, identifying Czech national history with the progress of humanity. The Reformation played a key role in the constitution of the Czech nation, which Masaryk saw as a precursor of the 19th century Czech national movement. So you have a establishment of a deliberate kind of liberal tradition here in the interwar period, not without critics. Jaroslav Goll or Josef Peka were critics of that liberal national historiography, but it was still, I think, pretty influential in interwar Czechoslovakia. We also have the case of historians upholding liberal narratives and developing liberal narratives in the face of defeat. In Italy, clearly we have, after 1923, the establishment of a fascist historiography, but we have people who, in a way, maintain the liberal national narrative, in particular Benedetto Croce, who under fascism publishes a history of Italy that is very much critical of the fascists and sort of upholding the kind of strong liberal tradition of the Risorgimento historiography of the 19th century. And we have, of course, people like the Roselli brothers who in exile try to develop a kind of historiography that portrayed the sort of Risorgimento as one of the unfulfilled promises in Italian history. They provided the kind of model for the Party of Action, the Resistance Party, and then the post-war Italian Party, which tried to merge again this kind of liberal narrative with a more social democratic ideal. But of course, they were very much not the mainstream. You had sort of fascist historians like Giovanni Gentile, who celebrated fascism as fulfillment of the Risorgimento, and you had even more mainstream historians such as Gioacchino Volpe, who also cooperated with the regime and Volpe's national history, L'Italia in Cammino, clearly identified fascism with the project of completing national unity that had started under the Risorgimento. In National Socialism, after 1933, you also have the development of a fascist historiography. But like in Italy, it was not the dominant one, but the sort of strongly statist and conservative historiography in Germany simply chose to support the National Socialist regime after 1933. Or at least most of them did. And you have here in Germany the case of a weak liberal national historiographical tradition, and insofar as there had been some developments in the interwar period, they were more or less abandoned after 1933, and most of its representatives had to go into exile after 1933. It's interesting to compare the developments in Germany with Hungary. I think, like in Weimar Germany, the peace treaties in Hungary produced a kind of national outcry. Like in Germany, the collapse of an empire resulted first in a liberal and immediately afterwards in a communist revolution that was ultimately defeated, and then a much more authoritarian political regime emerging in interwar Hungary, which broke with the liberal national historiography that had developed in the 19th century, and very different interpretations of key events such as 1848 were put forward by those historians close to the Horthy regime. In many of the new nation states of East Central Europe, historians who participated in projects to establish liberal democratic national master narratives ultimately battled against the odds. Many intellectuals, including historians, were attracted to constructions of national essences, which in turn contributed to the radicalization of historiographical nationalism. So we find in various countries, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, that a discourse on national characterology paved the way for historical interpretations that undermined liberal democratic thought and instead endorsed more radical ideologies. Perhaps a brief word on Spain as well. Spain, of course, was another country which had developed a very strong 19th century liberal historiographical tradition that was replaced under Franco with a kind of Catholic, fascist Catholic master narrative, and it found expression in the routine idealization of medieval Christendom, the stress on the moral purity of Spanish Catholic nationality. We have the strong role of the Opus Dei, both in many history departments and historical education more generally, in particular in the CISC. The nation became synonymous with the church and the monarchy. You had a range of sort of texts that undermined that. You had an attack on what was perceived by this new Catholic historiography as the kind of black legend in Spanish national history writing, the kind of liberal master narrative of the 19th century. So far we've only talked about the text from the right. Let's just have a brief look at a text from the left. The victory of Bolshevism in the Soviet Union for the first time allowed the emergence of a Marxist-Leninist historiography, and initially much of that historiography had to be created from scratch. In some respects, Soviet historians could rely on the writings of Georgy Plekhanov. Plekhanov's History of Russian Social Thought, published already in 1909, very much prioritized class over nation in line with general Marxist thinking at the time. He also had stressed the Russian backwardness vis-a-vis the West. And many Bolsheviks shared this belief in the essential backwardness of Russia, in particular Trotsky, who upheld these notions of Russian peculiarity in his own History of the Russian Revolution. Lenin and Stalin, by contrast, argued already before 1917 that Russia's development was in line with the West, and in some respects their steering of the newly emerging historiography under Mikhail Pokrovsky went into this direction. Pokrovsky, who was nicknamed the Supreme Commander of the Army of Red Historians, what a title, gave early Soviet historiography a distinct internationalist orientation. He actually abhorred Russian nationalism and was adamant that it was important for Marxist historians to look beyond the narrow confines of national history. So he, as Commissar for Education in the early Soviet Union, prohibited any history teaching which promoted nationalism. In his own writings, he put heavy emphasis on social and economic developments in history, which he argued were essential to document the class struggle in history. Despite all that, rather ironically, he could not escape national history. He was ordered to write a brief history of Russia, approved by no less a figure than Lenin, and it in effect served as kind of Bible for the first generation of Marxist-Leninist historians of the Soviet Union. As a national history, it was indeed trying to avoid historiographic nationalism. It portrayed the history of Tsarist Russia as dark other, where not only the working classes, but also the non-Russian nationalities, and we heard about this, were repressed. And he contrasted this dark Russian past sharply to the bright communist future of the Soviet Union under Bolshevism. However, all of this, in a way, was to change with Stalinism in the 1930s. Pokrovsky committed suicide, I think one of these suicides that are slightly dodgy in that period in the Soviet Union. But Stalin ordered a new national history to be written in the 1930s, and this national history was deliberately to promote Soviet patriotism. So you have the move from de-emphasizing historiographic nationalism to re-emphasizing historiographic nationalism under Stalin. And a historian called Shestakov, who also incidentally wrote the short course in the history of the USSR, published in 1937. He was one of the main promoters of this new national historiography. And for him, interestingly, the Russian past was no longer a dark past, but it was a necessary past. It was a necessary precondition for the Soviet present. The reader in his text is expressly invited to identify with many of the heroes of Russian history. The book finishes with the remarkable sentences for a historical book. We love our motherland and we must know her wonderful history well. Whoever knows history will better understand current life, will fight the enemies of our country better, and will consolidate socialism. So sort of nationalism as the basis of socialism. Of course, you also had the attempts to transnationalize history writing in professional historiography from the late 19th century onwards. You had the World History Congresses and the International Committee of the Historical Sciences. And if you look at the interwar period, you see very clearly its inability, its basic inability to uphold liberal national historiographical traditions. It becomes, in the interwar period, a platform for the diverse historiographic nationalisms that are using the World History Congresses as a platform to battle it out amongst them. Very occasionally, you do find also attempts to use transnationalism as a counter to historiographical nationalism, in particular in the work of Arnold Toynbee of the interwar period. Toynbee had completely changed his views on nationalism as a result of the First World War. Before 1914, he still applauded liberal national liberation movements in various parts of Eastern Europe. At the Peace Conference in 1919, he was still an advocate of the principle of national self-determination. However, thereafter, he increasingly came to abhor the ugly and destructive side of nationalism, which he saw as responsible for endless acts of violence and brutal barbarism. In his study of history, started in the 1920s, he was trying to write against the impending disasters of nationalism. I think, from the 1920s onwards, he became one of the strongest critics and used his kind of attempt to write a kind of global history also to counter the forces of historiographical nationalism. But I think his was not the only, but certainly quite a lone voice in interwar Europe. Very briefly, my final section on borders and borderlands. It's also intriguing to look at the way in which the changing borders were contributing to the popularity of history wars in the interwar period. Perhaps the best known case is the Polish-German border, where you have a distinct tradition of Polish Western research that is pitted against German Eastern research in the interwar period. but it's by no means the only story where these border conflicts exacerbate forms of historiographical nationalism. We find similar conflicts between Czech and German historians clashing in Bohemia and Moravia, Italian and Austro-German narratives clashing over the South Tyrol and over Trentino, Slovene and Austro-German accounts providing very distinct and conflicting stories over Lower Styria, Carinthia and Carniola. And this is just a few of those attempts where you have an exacerbation of historiographic nationalism due to the changing borders in the interwar period. Some of the newfound nation states, Lithuania would be a good example here, also massively attempted to nationalize their very multicultural and multinational territories in the interwar period, perceiving multiculturalism in particular as a major threat. Greater Romania would also be a good example in the interwar period. It had gained the provinces of Bessarabia, Bukovina, and Transylvania, they included also universities, which in the interwar period were comprehensively Romanianized. An institute for national history was set up at Cluj. The Romanian state actually sponsored a range of research institutes, all of them having the task of integrating these new regions into the enlarged Romanian state. Austria is the interesting case after the First World War of a state without a strong national historical master narrative. Here we have the distinct failure to develop such historiographical nationalism simply because mainstream German Austrian historiography oriented themselves towards Germany. And therefore, it was not developing a strong Austrian historiographical nationalism. So by way of conclusion, very briefly, I think what I've tried to show is how the First World War massively reshaped national historiographies in the interwar period, how it produced a kind of high point of historiographic nationalism in the long history of modern historiographical nationalism. And I think 4 points are particularly important: the question of the war guilt and the history wars that it engendered, the creation of new nation states that massively used history in order to provide legitimacy to these new states, the strong contestation of liberal national master narratives, both by right-wing authoritarian and fascist and by Soviet Bolshevik narratives, and finally the changing of borders, which produced new territorial orders, which also necessitated new historical legitimations. Thank you very much.